Hello there. My name's Bryden Oliver, and I'm here to talk to you tonight about building in the cloud without breaking the bank. And we're going to talk about Azure on a budget. Okay, so before we get started, here at SSW, we've got a rewards app. So if you want to scan the QR code you're seeing here in front of you, you can use that to earn points. And we've got the fitness bands and special water bottles that'll tell you the temperature. You'll always see Adam with all those bands on his wrist. So they're good fun. If you've scanned that and installed the app, we've got a QR code where you can earn 500 points for watching this talk. We will see it again at the end of the presentation. So if you are still installing it, don't worry, I'll show it again. So who am I? I'm Bryden Oliver. I'm an Azure solution architect. I've been working with Azure since its launch almost 15 years ago. I'm two inches shorter than I used to be after an unfortunate trampolining accident. I know all about Azure at high scale and particularly about Cosmos database. So if that's something you're interested in, you can catch up with me after this and ask a few questions. Okay, so what are we going to talk about tonight? So first of all, I'll introduce what problems we're trying to solve. And I'll talk to you about planning your Azure deployment, how you would actually deploy it. Then we'll talk a bit about how you would monitor that. And this is largely with respect to cost. And then we'll talk about how you can reduce the cost if things get out of hand. And then we'll have a very, very quick summary of the key points. So if I was to ask you, do you know what you are spending in Azure? Because I know lots of people watching will have Azure infrastructure deployed already. So how many of you know the cost of that? Probably most businesses will look at that monthly. So how much is your Azure costing? That's the first question. Most developers certainly don't know that off the top of their head. Second, did you plan ahead? Do you know what you were going to spend before you spent it? Were you able to go to your manager and say, look, what you're asking me to deploy, that's going to cost $1,000 a month. Are you still sure you want to do that? Third, are you monitoring the cost? So there's a good story that Troy Hunt, who runs Have I Been Pwned, had where he wasn't monitoring the cost of his Azure functions. And one day he got a bit of a bill shock after his Azure functions started consuming an awful lot more CPU than he thought. So you can go and look that up on his website to see how that one played out. And what will you do if the cost blows out? So if it's an ongoing problem, are there things you can do to get your cost back down? And we'll go through a few things there. So these are the problems that we're going to try and look at tonight, because Azure can cost a lot if you don't plan. So I've run a system that was running through, $100 and something thousand a month. So you can certainly spend a lot if you haven't planned. So the first thing we'll cover is understanding how much our application will cost and what sort of options we've got to tweak that a bit. We'll talk about how you can get it deployed correctly and make sure you've done that. We'll then make sure that we know what it is costing. And then if something goes wrong and it costs more than we want, we'll have a chat about what are the things we can do to reduce that cost again so that we can afford it. Okay, so the first thing we look at is planning before we go and deploy. I know many of you will already have things deployed and haven't gone through this step, but it's important to do this when you go to deploy a new application. So the first thing, and it's probably the critical choice in terms of how much things are going to cost you, is deciding whether you want a managed or an unmanaged service in Azure, or all of the cloud providers provide these managed or unmanaged services. So what do I mean by managed or unmanaged? So managed means Microsoft, in the case of Azure, is doing most of the management for you. And unmanaged means you're responsible for most of the management. And by management, I mean things like keeping it up to date, making sure it's backed up, ensuring security, all those sort of things. So if we look at a typical unmanaged Azure service, that would be something like a virtual machine. So if you're running your application on a virtual machine, you've got to install the OS on the virtual machine probably, or go and get an image. You've got to run all the updates. You've got to ensure it's running. You're responsible for almost everything. On the absolute other end of this spectrum, from that sort of very unmanaged system, you could go and run something on Azure Functions consumption plan, where you deploy your code and that's it. Basically, you just want to monitor occasionally to make sure that your code is behaving as you wanted it to. But that's probably all you have to do. So there's a very big difference in what amount of effort you've got to put in between those two solutions. So my advice, typically, particularly for smaller companies, is unless you've got a very, very good reason to go with an unmanaged service, go for a managed service so that you've got less to do yourselves. The other thing with the managed and unmanaged is it's much easier to know what it's going to cost, because there's fewer hidden costs with the managed services than the unmanaged, and we'll have a chat about why that is and what those hidden costs typically are. The other thing is it can be a bit harder with the managed services to reduce cost, but in theory, you've got a better handle on the cost in the first place. So the key one here is we've got a bunch of hidden costs. Our monthly Azure spend isn't the whole cost of our application. We've probably got other infrastructure in the picture. We've got some costs to build the application in the first place. We've got some support costs, and we're potentially missing opportunities. So let's go through all of those and talk in a bit more detail about what we mean. So other infrastructure. For most of our applications, there'll be other things at play. Things like Cloudflare, Hotjar, other applications that we use to supplement our Azure applications. Most of these other infrastructure are typically small SaaS-based products, but we need to remember the cost of all of these. The second big cost center is initial development costs. This is typically where a huge amount of the money goes. Development costs you a lot of money. It costs you staff time. You need to rent an office, equipment, internet, and all of that, or your staff have to pay for that if they're working from home. So a typical thing that most businesses do is they turn their staff time into a daily rate that includes everything that the business needs to pay to cover having a developer. And that's the developer's wages, the admin staff to help them, maybe some test, somebody to help them test, anything else they need, like food in the kitchen, if there's tea and coffee provided, all of those sort of things, rent. And that's normally called a fully loaded head cost. So when you're using this for this sort of purpose, we don't want a super accurate number. We just want a ballpark figure. So it might be you go to your manager and say, roughly, what does it cost us to do development every day for one of us? Is it $1,000? Is it $10,000 a day, or what? But that at least means you can compare your Azure costs to your development, to your developers. Now, the other big manpower cost is ongoing support costs. And again, this is primarily staff time. Most companies try and plan how much of this time they need, but it's very hard to get that right. It's very hard to know how much support and ongoing maintenance your application is going to need, particularly if your customers have trouble using your product or something. And this ongoing support costs is typically where your choice of managed versus unmanaged services comes back to bite you. If you went unmanaged, this number is typically much higher, but your infrastructure Azure costs, or AWS costs if you're using some AWS, will be lower. And the other reason I recommend managed services primarily is because of the missed opportunity costs. If you're spending a lot of time deploying and keeping your infrastructure up to date, the people who are doing that aren't developing you new software. So you may miss opportunities. And it's that requiring lots of support for your applications is the big thing that stops startups in particular being able to scale and bring out new features. So be aware that managed services for startups and small business really makes sense because you can scale much more quickly. Okay. So these days, the architecture of our applications does matter. How something is built does influence the cost. And in my view, it's the managed versus unmanaged is the biggest differentiator on cost. And I'm of a firm belief that the managed services over the long run cost you a lot less. But we need to ensure we know what it costs and how we'll reduce costs if we need to. So with that in mind, let's have a chat about scaling. So this is what's going to happen as our business grows. And most of the cloud-based services can scale in different ways. So let's have a think about, and I'm going to be using this example a lot, Azure Functions on a consumption plan. With that, you pay for each execution of your function and how much CPU it uses in that execution. So if I get one execution and then next week I get 100 executions, my cost goes up by a factor of 100. So that's really easy to calculate. But it's also fairly bad as I start growing. I would want to try and start leveling that cost off and not just continue in a straight line as I grow. So great to start with, maybe not so great as we grow. The other typical way things scale is in a fixed way. So by fixed, I mean something like VMs, or if we're using Azure App Service, typically you have a fixed number of instances deployed, and each instance costs you, say, $200 a month, regardless of how many requests it serves. And it will only serve X number of requests. But until we hit that limit, our cost's the same. So if we can serve, 10,000 customers with that one instance and we're already paying for it when we've only got one customer, we don't have to pay more until we hit that point where we need another one. And one thing to be aware of here is you very often see that your dev and your test environment have a completely different cost profile to production. So typically production, once you get going, ends up being significantly larger than test. So my first piece of advice when you're writing an application you expect to slowly scale up is, if the service that you want to run it on, like Azure Functions or the storage engines, there's a couple of consumption-based storage engines, use the consumption-based ones. As you grow, you can then move to an allocated model. Certainly with Azure Functions, you can move with almost zero change in your code and very little downtime. You can move to an allocated service without having to go through major re-architecture as you would have had to do back in the old on-prem days, you'd have had to install it on new servers and you'd have had to configure them. So there was a huge investment if you needed to change servers. These days, that's one of the beauties of cloud computing, is there really isn't that cost to change your deployment in the way you used to. Now, the next thing is, once you've got a stable load and you're running on these allocated services, there's typically what are called Azure reserved instances. And this is where you commit to, for 1 or 3 years, to continue buying that same service. And in exchange, Microsoft gives you a significant discount, which on some of the services is up to 55% of the cost. So it's not a small discount. It's a very, very significant discount if you know you're going to continue consuming that service at that rate for a very long time. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to have a chat about is we'll go through an example of how we would plan out the costs. So I'm going to use the example of the SSW Rewards app. So this is an application we have in-house. And let's have a think about what we would expect the load profile for that to be. You saw what it was. It was basically a mobile application. Behind that, we've got a web app, a web API, where every time you scan those QR codes, we write that somewhere and process it. So we'll talk about the web API primarily here. The main load on that is as users scan our QR codes. So all of the various SSW employees, if they're doing a presentation somewhere, they'll have a QR code that you can scan. So what happens is when someone's presenting, typically our load goes on a spike, goes up, and it'll be a bit spiky for, probably about an hour, and then it'll fall away again and be reasonably low for a very long time after that. So if I was building that, and I'd be building that on Azure Functions consumption plan to start with, until we started getting to the point where we couldn't scale that far enough to cope with the load while we were having an event. At the moment, I think it probably is on Azure Functions still. And the next thing I would do is figure out what sort of storage I wanted. I probably wanted in some sort of table, but SQL Server seems quite expensive or any of the big relational databases seem quite expensive for this purpose. There's a much cheaper alternative called Azure Table Storage, as long as it doesn't matter how long it takes you to write to that database. If you're not too fussed about how long it takes, Azure Table Storage is a great, really, really, really cheap option. Okay, so let's go and have a look at, having chosen those few things, how we would go about pricing that up and seeing exactly how much that might cost us every month. So we would go over here to azure.microsoft.com and search for the pricing calculator. So let's have a look at it. So we'll go right up to the top of it. And the first thing you'll see here is they've got some example scenarios. So you can have a look at, here's a few things, and it'll give you a diagram of what you might have wanted. Then this section here, which is all the common things, and you can search and filter this list, and you can just click on one of these, and then they appear in this section down the bottom where we have an estimate. So I've already put in the details of what I suggested on the slide there. So we've got Azure Functions on consumption tier. So I'm not fussed where it went, so I just picked West US. It's on consumption. And then they've got a note telling me that the first 400,000 gigabyte seconds of execution and the first million executions are free. Okay, so it then lets me decide how much memory I think my app will use. And if I've actually started writing it on my locally, I can figure out what that number actually is. I might also know that it's going to take 100 milliseconds to execute my function. And then, depending on how many times I think my endpoint's going to get called, and I've guessed I'll get 100,000 people scanning those QR codes every month. So that seemed a reasonable number. So I've plugged that in. And this tells me that it's going to cost me $0. Gee, that free offer sounds pretty good, particularly in the early days of my application. I'm not paying anything. And I'm not paying anything for the execution count because I didn't get to the 1 million. So my upfront cost and my monthly cost is $0. Wow. But remember, this is just the compute so far, so maybe something else will cost a bit more. So I'm going to write going to host those QR codes that you can scan somewhere so that the mobile app can go and get them. So for that, I need a bit of blob storage. So this is just some basically file storage. And, I've picked West US for that. Maybe we'll East US. The other one's on West US, so I'll put it in the same spot. And I think there's about 10 gig of those that we'll need to start with. So actually, no, I've decided it'll be 20 gig. We're going to get a few more employees who are going to go out and do a few more events. So I know that we've got 10 gig of them sitting in the hard drive ready to go. I'd better plan for a bit of growth. So what's that costing me? It's only costing me $4 roughly so far. So I don't need to worry too much about that. And now we get to some of the things that might be a bit more interesting. It asks you how many write operations are you going to do, and how many list and create container operations, and how many read operations. And you'll see that writes are 10 times the cost of a read. But it's only 2 cents per 10,000 operations. That should be fine. I'm not going to do hundreds of thousands. So I reckon I'll do 100,000 because I'll do one of these off each one of those API calls I had before. This is just a random guess, so that sounds good to me. So they're going to cost 23 cents. And then we've got some list and stuff. So, but all up, that's only going to cost me $5. So this app's sounding pretty good now, isn't it? It's not really going to break the bank as long as it doesn't cost me much to build it in the first place. Like if I don't spend months and months building this is great. And what was the other thing we needed? We needed something to store some relational data in. So we picked table storage. Oh, and again, we've put it on the wrong region. So we switched that over. And I'd like the redundancy change so I can see what, and as you can see, the estimate changes instantly. So this is quite good. You can play around and go, if I wanted the extra features of going to that level of redundancy, how much extra will it cost? So I know I've got less than 10 gig of data. And again, it's going to cost us 50 cents. So I've gone and done my estimates. I can go back to my manager and say, you know, the infrastructure for that app, that's going to cost us about $15 a month. Is that okay? And if you said $15 a month, I don't think many managers would be going, no, you can't have that much. But you can get into situations where it's costing a lot more than that. So there are situations where you do have to be a bit more careful. All right. So that was our first example. And that was, so we've been through how we would plan it. And you might go and do a much more detailed version of that pricing calculator. You can put in as many services as you need. So you can build up your architecture diagram and then sit down in that and cost out the architecture that you think you're about to deploy. So now we just mentioned the word deploy. So when I'm deploying, I like to do it through infrastructure as code. That's a really good way of doing it because I can set it up write it once, and I can reuse it. And it's easy to make things repeatable if I want another environment for test, or I just want to deploy something for a couple of days and do some load testing on it. I just run the same script with different parameters. So I reckon always deploy using infrastructure as code and build that deployment with some parameters. The key things that you think you're going to want to change. So one of my colleagues, William Liebenberg, does a lot of this. He talks a lot on Bicep, so you can have a look at that GitHub page. He's got some great doco available there and some good examples. And you can learn a lot about how to deploy your systems there. In terms of deployment, I always like to start with smaller deployments for my dev and staging environments. Don't worry about the scale on them while you're building the application right at the start. One thing to be aware of is that if you're using some of the smaller sections of some of the smaller things in the Azure pricing models, they have what are called tiered services. You may have basic, standard, premium. Typically, when you go from basic to standard, you'll get some more features, as well as it's scaling a bit further. And typically, you normally go between these tiers for one of those two reasons, not necessarily both. So you may go to the more expensive tier for scale, or you may go because you need some critical feature that's only in the more expensive tier. So if you check the detailed pricing page for each of the services, it tells you in detail what features you get on each tier. The pricing page often has those little information things that we saw on the demo there, but they don't give you it for everything. So they don't tell you some of the other ones. Some of the more odd ones are things like event hubs. If you're on the standard tier, the server that's running your event hub is shared with other consumers, so you can get what's called noisy neighbors. If you go as your event hub premium, it's on your own. It's a server dedicated to you. So someone else doing an awful lot of load will not annoy you. So you've got dedicated capacity if you do that. So there's often a distinction between the tiers. Okay, the other thing to do is verify your cost after you've deployed all of the pieces, so that you know what the sort of fixed monthly costs are. You typically do need to finish your app before you know what the dynamic costs are, like how much network usage you might see, how fast the database is going to grow as you add rows to each of the tables. So you do need to do quite a bit of planning there. Okay, so let's have a think about monitoring it. And this is where people quite often go wrong. They don't do any monitoring and then they get a shock 1 month. So my advice is build your cost monitoring early so you don't get that bill shock, because it's not very nice when your manager comes to you and says, you know, that service you said was going to cost $100 a month. I just got the bill and it's $10,000 this month. That's not a nice conversation. So that's why you should build your cost monitoring really, really early so you don't ever have to have that conversation. And luckily in Azure, just setting a budget might be good enough. And you can have alerts that can warn you once you're over budget and potentially turn things off if you write a little bit of script. So we'll go and have a look at how we do that. So I'm in the Azure portal. All I've done is gone, in fact, I'll go back to the start here and I'll pick my subscription. This one's my one. And I want a cost alert on my subscription. I don't want to overspend. I've only got a $200 limit on here, so already, and that's fixed. But what I'm going to do is come in here, go to cost alerts and say add. So what I want is I'm going to add a budget. You could also add an anomaly alert, which means if something's significantly different to what's expected, it will warn you. But this is the standard one that most people will use. I'm going to call it test 2. I want to take my budgeting on the billing month. So I'm not too fussed what it cost last month. I really am worried about whether my bill this month is going to be out of hand. So that seems perfect. And you can see here on the right, it's giving you some data to be able to figure out what settings you might want to use. So it's telling me that I spent $10 in June, $10 in July, $10 in August, and then things got a bit more expensive as the year went on. So we're up around the $75, $80 a month. So that gives me some good data to be able to do here. You'll notice here it suggests what my budget should be based on Microsoft's analysis of my usage. I reckon I'm going to budget for $100 a month going forward. I'm not too fussed if it goes. That's as much as I'm prepared to spend. So I want to be warned if anything's going wrong with that. So after I've put in how much I want to spend, it then asks me to set up some alerts on that. So I actually want to alert on the forecast, because the key thing I want is if usage suddenly spikes and it knows on day 2 of the month that I'm going to go 10 times over my budget, I want it to tell me on day 2, not on day 10 when it's when I've already burnt through the whole budget. I want it to tell me early. So I always use the forecasted budget, and I want it to warn me if it's going to go 20% over budget. So I can just do that, and then I can get it to email me, and I would click create, and that's all I have to do. And that means Microsoft will email me if my Azure bill is going to be higher than I was prepared for. So that's really, really quite simple to set up. And for most companies, that's enough. It'll warn me once I'm over budget, or if it's predicted to go over budget, which is even better. You could even turn off stuff if you write a little bit of script, but just knowing is probably enough early on in your life cycle. Okay. So we've had a chat about how we plan it, how we deploy it, how we monitor it. And our monitoring is showing that consistently every month we're going over that budget. So what could we do about that? This is where we need to start thinking about reducing cost. And this is the big one we've got to keep an eye on, because this is where a lot of companies go wrong. So the first thing with your service is to understand how it will scale. Because as your application grows, the costs will start to change a bit. Now, typically there's a significant fixed component, which is all of the infrastructure that's got to be there and you're paying for, regardless of whether anyone's using your application or not. And then there's typically a usage-based component. So the other thing that I may often talk to our clients about is it's going to take effort to reduce the cost. We need to think about how much time and effort we're going to put into reducing the cost, and therefore how much is that time going to cost, and how long will it take us to get a return on investment? And that's the critical question I think everyone should ask before they start trying to cut their Azure costs or any other cost in their business really is, if I go to the effort of trying to reduce my costs, how long is it going to take me to recoup the amount of time I spent doing that? So I see a lot of companies spend an enormous amount on savings efforts, and they may spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're only saving a couple of $100 a month as a result. And that ends up with them having to wait 20 or 30 years for a return on investment. So in cloud computing, it's not worth it unless you're getting that return on investment quite quickly. So typically that starts when your bill starts getting up to, $5,000 or $10,000 a month. Then it's worth, say, putting in, $5,000 or $10,000 worth of development effort to try and knock a few thousand off that. But if you think you can only knock off a few hundred or tens of dollars, it's really not worth it. So the first thing I do is I look at the cost and try and break it down. So first thing, what are the biggest three costs? Because if you can't reduce those, typically you can't really reduce your cost, because typically those first three costs are, in most applications, 90+% of your costs. So if you can't reduce those, you may as well not even start because the costs, you're already into diminishing returns after those first three. One thing that's very common is people will remove and say, I've saved 90% of our storage costs. And then you say, so how much were your storage costs? And they'll go, $5 a month. Okay, so you've saved $4.50 every month for me. And you spent 10 days doing that, did you? The other problem is that still leaves all the big costs. So don't be the person who goes and reduces all the tiny costs and penny pinches right at the edges. Go for your big costs first. Okay. So let's go and have a look at Azure cost analysis in a second. First, we'll go through why I like it, and then I'll show it to you and show why I think it's great. So the first thing is that it's really good at slicing and dicing your costs. So it's very easy to find out where the costs are. It's also very, very easy to use. So those are the two critical things that I think make it very easy to actually figure out what's going on with your Azure build. So let's go and have a look at that. So I've got this one prepared earlier. So because I don't spend a lot in Azure, I've had to go to this drop down and set it to 12 months so that there was actually enough spending to be worth looking at. Typically, when you come in, it will be set to 1 month. Why is that coming up all the time? All right. So let's go and have a look at what we get on the page. Maybe we'll just tell it to. And I just changed that to a slightly different thing. So it's now going away and grabbing all my billing data. It doesn't take very long to come back. And I can do things like get it in an accumulated fashion, or it can show me, here's what I'm spending every month. So you'll see I did have a very big month in March, but other than that, I really haven't spent too much. But the other thing, and this is where it gets really kind of nice, is I can go down here. You can see I've got the resource groups here, and I can see I've got a Synapse resource group. I was doing a whole bunch of testing and trying to figure out how Synapse worked, and that clearly was that one. So if I click on that one, all of this will filter down to just that resource group. And here we go. Oh, and that's what all that cost was in March. So obviously that must have been March. I was doing all my Synapse research. One thing a lot of people miss on this is if you go back up, these are the filters it's put on here. I want to remove the filters again. So I don't. So I want to go and slice it differently. So It's telling me where it is. So if I had global operations and had systems deployed in every region, I could see which regions were costing me more. So that's quite useful for those sort of applications. The other thing is we've got service name here, but the other beauty is I can go and select something else. So I can go to meter subcategory here, which is another one that's very useful because it lets me see things like, although a lot of stuff goes in this no meter subcategory, you'll see that the storage, bandwidth, this is for things like storage accounts, those extra fees that you pay on top of the actual raw storage every time you read and write stuff from it. So this lets you drill into those. So as you can see, I can go and see what was costing me money in March. No, maybe I can't do that one. But I can go and say, oh, all right, I want to see what my service bus was costing me. And I'll see that I've spent $140 on service bus. It's one of those things that has no meter subcategory, so I mustn't have had anything fancy going on in there. But as you can see, it was very easy to drill down to what was costing me what and when was it costing that. Okay, so if we head back to the presentations. So the next thing to figure out when you're looking through that sort of data is which ones are the static costs. So in other words, if I go and lose customers or gain customers, which things are going to go up and down and which ones aren't. So if I've got a whole bunch of static costs, you need to ask things like, do I need the number of instances I've got deployed? Can I reduce the load on the instances and therefore just reduce the number of instances? And finally, can I move to reserved instances to save money? If the costs are dynamic costs, we've got a different set of levers that we would think about. And we have much more scope to reduce costs in these. So with dynamic billing, every transaction or execution costs us money. And because of that, if we can shorten a transaction, typically we save money. If we can make it smaller in terms of kilobytes or size, it costs us less money. But be aware these dynamic costs may not scale linearly, particularly if you get to quite high scale. You can get things like contention and suddenly your dynamic costs run away even with very little extra load. So what you can do is find that reducing your load by say 10% may actually save you 90% of the costs. I have seen that before on certain services where there was high contention. The thing here is efficient code is now valuable again. If you're all writing one of these moderate to high scale applications, it's actually worth being efficient because it's been like roughly a decade where we've just been able to write these super inefficient code. And if someone said it's getting a bit slower, people would go, well, extra compute's cheap. We'll just throw some more compute at it. That's cheaper than getting you guys to make it more efficient. It is getting to the point with a lot of these things that the scale is getting high enough now that it's actually worth fixing this. So those developers who take their time and write super efficient code are becoming more valuable again. And it's also a time where it's good to understand the algorithmic complexity of your things. Is it linear complexity? Is it logarithmic complexity, or is it exponential? If it's exponential, that's where you're going to be in trouble, because as your customer base grows, your costs are potentially going to rise exponentially. So that's the worst possible case scenario, is where your costs go up. You know, if you go from 10 to 100 customers, it goes up 10,000 times in cost. You're going to be dead if you get any more customers. If you've got the opposite, where it's got this sort of curve, that's beautiful because as you grow more customers, the cost starts leveling out beautifully, and that's where your profit margin starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and everyone's happy at that point. So most organizations don't have very many people who understand computational efficiency. So they need, these organizations, as they grow, are having to relearn these skills that have been lost over the last decade or so. So how do we find out what our behavior under load is going to be and how much things are going to cost? We're going to have to do some scale testing to discover the nuances. And the really big question you really want to answer is, how far will my solution scale as it is now? Because a lot of these applications, what you do is you build it nice and cheap now, and you go, I know it'll scale. I do a bit of testing and I say, it's going to scale until I've got 10,000 customers. So as I get around 7,500 customers, it's about time to start thinking about how I'm going to scale to 100,000 customers or more. But I don't need to solve that problem until then. I just need to have a vague idea of that there is some way of doing it. I just need to be sure I can scale further without a significant investment. And Azure is great in that a lot of these, you just move up onto the next tier of the service and it continues scaling out. And many of them will go to pretty much infinite scale. Okay, so if we're trying to figure out what's going on, there's a whole bunch of things we can do. We can dig out profilers, like application insights, SQL Server profiler if it's SQL. We can write our own logging code. So we want to get some idea of where our costs are coming from. And one thing that I find is very useful is figuring out which bits of the application are costing all the money. And in particular, what you often see is specific features end up costing you all the money. So, and what typically happens is if you can say 95% of your application's running costs are because you've got this report here, and you go to the product owner and they go, really? That's 95% of the cost of the application? I thought that was really easy. Yeah, it was really easy, but it requires an enormous amount of resources. And they'll go, oh, I'm the only one who ever reads that. I know no one else has ever read that report. Maybe we don't need it. And that's often the best way of saving money, is just going, I don't need that feature because it costs more than its value. So it's not valuable enough to pay that amount of money for. So let's now go through a couple of the gotchas and go through, these are the ones where people are spending too much money and we've got to be careful of. So application insights is probably the worst offender in terms of, you go into an organization, you look at their costs and you go, really? And in fact, it's probably 25%, I would guess, of the organizations I've looked at. Application insights is actually costing more than the application. So your monitoring is costing more than the solution it's monitoring, and often significantly more. There are a bunch of really easy dials on application insights, so we can get that down. So the first dial you've got is they have automatic sampling, and that will reduce it. You can reduce that down to 1% of the normal data collection, and it will just retrieve telemetry on 1% of requests. There is a gotcha here though. If it's exception data, it's not subject to sampling. So if you're getting millions of exceptions, turning on sampling won't help. There's a bunch of other cases where you may want to do something like the out-of-the-box sampling, which you can do. You can roll your own sampling and go lower than that 1%. That's just, they just support integers of percentages. Or if you want something special, like we had one application where there was one endpoint that was being hit like 100 million times a month, roughly. And we had two other APIs on it that were being called 10 or 15 times a month. And the problem was we had no telemetry whatsoever on those two other APIs, and we wanted some. So it didn't take very long to write a sampling routine that you could pick a sampling rate for each one of those calls. So you could say, I want 0.1% of the very heavy, often called one, and I want 100% of the other two, or 50% of one call and 100% of another. So that's great if your application needs it, and you can find a few examples around of how you go about doing that. The other one that you see very, very often is Azure storage is often a huge cost. And the thing here is it's the transactions that kill people, not the raw storage. So the storage itself is outrageously cheap. It's really cheap to keep data in Azure storage. It's the transactions that get you. And the mistake people make is writing too often and writing tiny. So I've seen applications where people are putting sort of, maybe only a few gigabytes of data into Azure storage, but if you're doing that in one case, it was 4 bytes at a time. So they were writing 4-byte blobs, just millions upon millions upon millions of these. And the problem is they charge you per 10,000 transactions. So if you're doing hundreds of millions of transactions, it does add up and can be your most expensive thing. So the way of fixing this is writing bigger chunks, and if you can, write less often. So just make the chunks bigger if you can. So the worst offender for this is another one that's sort of out of the box with Azure Functions. If you're using the Azure Storage Queues trigger, what happens is it's got a watermark stored in blob storage. And what will happen is when you get a request coming added to the storage queue, there's actually 3 transactions each time it goes and grabs data out of the storage queue. There is a dial for adjusting that, which is the batch size. So some people set the batch size down to 1 because they want their storage queues to respond really, really fast if anything goes into that queue. The problem is that's 3 transactions for every item you stick in the queue. If you're getting millions of those items in the queue, that's going to cost you a significant amount of money. And all you need to do is set the batch size up to, say, 64 or 128 or something. And suddenly that cost goes down by a factor of 64 or 128. So it's great. That's a very significant saving you get just by changing one piece of config, just like the application insights. That's just one single config item you've changed. So once you've figured out that that was the cost, it's cost you, 20 minutes of time and then a little bit of observation later in the day to see that your changes had the desired effect. So that's the sort of change you want to be making, where you've got low cost of making the fix and high return on investment. So the other thing you can do is ensure your application is efficient, same as you did on premises in traditional systems. Now, the thing here is you want to optimize to reduce CPU or memory or I/O, as really that's all Microsoft ever charge you for. You only get charged for all of the bits of the computers that they're putting in and your usage of it. The one thing they do very often in these services is they charge you for CPU and memory and I/O all as one bucket. So you get, Azure App Service is a great example of this. You typically buy a single core machine with, say, 7.5 gig of RAM, and it can do 10,000 I/O operations a second. So that means if I go and max out the CPU, but I'm not using the memory or the I/O, that's costing me quite a bit more than if I used all three. So let's have a look at a typical application. So this is what a lot of people's applications will look like. Is we've got 100% of one of the metrics. In this case, it's CPU. And we're only using 20% of the memory and 20% of the I/O bandwidth. So if we want to be efficient, if we know which of those components are driving the cost right now, we can adjust our algorithms in a way that suits reducing the driver, potentially at the expense of something else. So the most common solution I've seen here is normally memory is one of the ones that seems to be very low. And it's typically CPU or I/O that are the ones that are maxed out. And in both cases, caching of complex calculations, if it's CPU or just of what's being read and written, reduces those numbers. It increases your memory, but you don't have to pay for that. And you can quite often reduce the number of instances you require just by adjusting the profile of your application to better utilize what you've actually been given. Okay, so now we'll just go through a quick summary of the key points. And there are really, behind this, there are only 3 or 4 key things to keep in mind as absolute takeaways I think you should all remember. So the first one is use managed services where you can. There's very rarely not a reason to move beyond those unless you've got very specialized expertise and are able to utilize something, the raw machine, better. The second one, only optimize things where there's a return on investment. Don't go spending a lot of money trying to save a little money. Ooh, we'll go back. We want to plan for right now, but have an eye to the future. So have at least know when the next scale point gets reached, i.e. where you've got to the point where your application won't scale anymore. What is your next move? So how am I going to address that when I get close to that? How much runway do I need? Do I need 2 months to deal with that? Do I need a year? Do I need 2 years of development? And finally, monitor your costs. Don't let them get out of hand. Don't get that 1 month of bill shock. And I think this phrase, this quote, really sums up what I've talked about here. With everything in business, the benefit gained should exceed the cost incurred. Or expressed another way, don't do unprofitable stuff. Okay, and I promised to show you the QR code for the rewards at the end. So here's the QR code again. And I'm quite happy to take any questions if anyone's sent in any questions.
So I've got a few questions from the audience.
Okay.
So number 1, how is network bandwidth charged for in Azure?
It's typically charged for in terms of number of transactions and amount of data transferred.
Right.
In some of the services, it's one. In some of them, it's both. And in some, so there's sort of two billing metrics, and some of them use both, and some of them use one or the other.
Interesting. So can we use ChatGTP to write algorithmically efficient code and save code in Azure?
I think you probably could. I'd be slightly careful, but of course you're going to test this code before you deploy it, so it's not so much of a concern. I was having a chat to ChatGPT and found it was very, very confident when it was getting stuff wrong. Like it would tell me stuff, and I knew outright it was wrong, but it was convinced.
There you go. Yeah, that's very interesting. So have you seen William Liebenberg's Spend Ops? And do you have any takeaways on that session?
I have. So that session was very much looking at how you can instrument an application to try and get that logging data that we were talking about. So this was, and from memory, that one was talking about how you can do this with Cosmos, where you get on every transaction you do, you get back the billing, and he was writing the billing data for each transaction you did on the database into something so that he knew what was going on. And yeah, that's the sort of thing I was talking about when I said you may want to write your own logging.
Yeah.
And that's a good example of that one.
Right. Okay. So one more question. What's the biggest bill you've ever seen on Azure for a whole year?
For a whole year?
Yeah.
For one service, it was going through about 140,000 US per month. So that's about $200,000 Australian a month.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So that's 2.5 million-ish.
Wow. That's a lot.
Yes, that was quite a lot of money.
Yeah.
That was the one where we reduced it by 95% by doing a little bit of architectural change.
Right. Okay. That's a lot of money to spend on just.
Yes.
Yeah, and you don't know it's going if you don't have it set up right.
That's right. You could have been doing that. Well, I mean, your manager would notice the $100,000 bill or $200,000 bill the first month.
Yeah, that's crazy that went on for a whole year. Yeah. All right. Thanks so much, Bryden. That was awesome. Definitely going to watch my Azure bills from now on.
Thank you very much for
And
having us.
Thanks everyone for coming in person tonight, and everyone online as well for watching. I'm Brady Stroud, and I'll see you next time.